All right, I'd like to go ahead and start our second lecture for week 13 here by taking a look, and this is sort of to preview where we're going. So, where we're going next week is we're going to be turning in our argument section and we're going to be moving on talking about Writing Workshop 4. And before we get to Writing Workshop 4, I want to treat this as kind of just a little bit of a preview, and I want to sort of consider a beginning point of understanding what the counter argument section actually is, because I imagine you're going to have a lot of questions about this. Like, why am I doing this? Okay. And you'll see here, just to begin with, I have two versions of my talking heads where one version of me is saying graphic novels are works of literature, and the other version of me angrily saying, no, they're not. They're just trash for that rots kids' brains. And I sort of put that in red and green. And I sort of put down here, this is a very rough form of what it's like when someone makes a statement, a claim, or an argument, and then another person counters you with another statement or argument. Of course, this is the, shall we say, less cordial side of it. But the idea being here that, this happens to be the idea that since we do not have the opportunity to necessarily, in the course of our writing, engage with an audience, or an audience, whether that audience agrees or disagrees with us, we sort of, in order to strengthen our own arguments, have to take on the responsibility of playing both parts. And this is what we're going to be doing. And I'm going to circle back here when we're done talking to what I'm going to be asking you to do in this forum, okay? So first here, we want to get an understanding. We'll talk more about this next week, but I want us to start thinking about this. And so the idea of when we present a counter argument, when we're writing it, is a step-by-step process, similar to what we do when we integrate a quotation. We first of all introduce. Okay, so the idea here is when we're dealing with this, where you can examine the process, we present our argument and our reasons first. After that, we have given our side, we entertain potential counter arguments or potential arguments against our own. And then after we entertain those arguments, we're going to refute them. But it's going to follow a similar process. So you'll see here, we're here in this step 4, all right, the classical model. And a counter argument really follows a very similar process to what we do in the argument. The first thing that you have to kind of consider is when you're introducing something in your argument, the first thing you do is you have a topic sentence, and then you kind of introduce the subject under discussion. You then, of course, cite it in some form, usually using a source, and then your explanation follows. And in that explanation, you kind of go through the process of attaching it back to your thesis statement. We're going to do something very similar in the counter argument section, except what we're going to do here is we're going to present a possible alternative, or in some cases opposition, and in some cases perhaps a question that our audience might have. We're going to then give them the other point of view, whatever that might be, whether it be summarizing, paraphrasing, or whatnot. But when it then comes time the explanation, because up until this point it feels like we're working against ourselves, well, the explanation then becomes an opportunity where we actually push back against this other narrative. It's our opportunity to explain and once again reconnect back to our thesis. So we'll see this working, and we'll flesh this out a little bit more next week. But I want to talk about the different kinds of, shall we say, counter arguments that can happen. First of all, sometimes there is a naysayer. And when I say a naysayer, or an imagination of a naysayer, what we're talking about here is the idea that there might be an actual person or source out there that disagrees with you. There may also be a group of people you could imagine that might be in disagreement with you. Okay? Now, this little line here says that although it's naturally tempting to ignore criticism or ideas when crafting an argument, doing so may in fact be a big mistake, since our writing improves when we not only listen to these objections, but give them an explicit hearing in our writing. In fact, no single device more quickly improves a piece of persuasive writing and the credibility of the author, that's your ethos, than planting a naysayer in the text. In other words, imagining what others might say against your argument and addressing these objections head on. So it's an opportunity for you to kind of interact with the audience in a way that you control. Here's the idea, of course, it enhances their ethos, it disarms critics, because someone might be reading your paper and they might think to themselves, well, what about this? Well, what if you already addressed that in the counter argument? You alleviate that sense of question. Now, sometimes there's an actual person, an actual source. Like if I were making an argument for the potential real life value of comic books, I could go all the way back to the 1950s and I could engage my naysayer, might be, say, Frederick Wortham, who wrote a book about comic books. I may or may not have mentioned this. And then there's another gentleman by the name of Mr. North. These are all people who were adamantly against comic books in a very virile way. That if I wanted to have this conversation and I wanted to engage a naysayer, they might be any number of potential naysayers out there. And I may want to go find out what they say, bring it into my paper. But then what I'm going to do is give them a voice and then kind of push back against them. And we're going to talk about ways we can do that, okay? We might also relate a counter argument. So sometimes we have this idea that we have, and this is something, by the way, that you will all be needing to deal with. Whether or not you have a naysayer or not is dependent sometimes, but you will all have counter arguments. And I'm going to tell you right now, the counter argument you're going to first engage with is the antithesis of your thesis. So if your thesis was arguing that graphic novel blank is a work of literature, guess what your counter argument, first one out the gate, should be? There are those who say that graphic novels are not or should not be considered a work of literature. Okay, there you go, right off to the races. Then you're going to want to sort of give us something that they might say and then push back. And so it's actually an opportunity for you to, in the moment of pushing back against a criticism, offer more evidence in support of your argument, okay? And one of the ways we're going to talk about how we can do this, and I think there's a slide missing here. Yeah, one of my images didn't load. One second, I will see why it's not loading, but I believe it's over here. Yeah, this is the slide that didn't note. This idea of refutation. Okay, this is the one that didn't load for us on previously, so I don't know why it's not loading on that page, but it's up on the page, so it wasn't on that version of it. This is where I just talk about the idea that there are a couple ways to handle this. There is the ability to refute, and there's also the ability to engage in what's called concession. Concession I want to talk more about next week, but the general idea behind a concession is, if you're familiar with the adage from football that the bend but don't break defense, or the idea that you can give a little ground but you don't give up the fight, the idea of a concession is you are willing to sort of meet your opposition halfway. You may be willing to give a little ground, but you're not going to give up the argument. So the idea is of something like maybe you agree with the conclusion, but you disagree with the means by which they come to the conclusion. Or maybe you disagree with the conclusion altogether, but you saw the relevance of their means of getting there. So there's a little bit more to it. We'll talk about that, but I did share an example here. Let me just read this real quickly. This is Chernin, a woman named Kim Kiernan, who is talking about starting off a counter argument. And she leaves off with this line right here where she says, admit it, you like yourself better when you lose weight. Now, ultimately, she's talking about this idea of complaining about pressure on American women to lose weight. So she's obviously arguing from this point of view that there's this cult of losing weight that oppresses women in America, okay? But this sentence right here is her leading off a counter-argument section where, admit it, you like yourself better when you've lost weight. That seems to be against her position, but this is what she's doing. This is why this is called a concession. She says, can I deny these things? No woman who's ever managed to lose weight would wish to argue with this. Most people feel better about themselves when they become slender. Now, all this up until this point is her giving a concession. She is basically giving ground to things that she cannot refute, okay? She's basically saying this is a reality. Can't argue against this, but watch this phrase right here. And yet. That's a key phrase. When she says, and yet, upon reflection, it seems to me that there is something precarious about this well-being. After all, 98% of people who lost weight gain it back. Indeed, 90% of those who have dieted successfully gain back more than they have ever lost. Then, of course, they can no longer bear to look at themselves in the mirror. So you see what she did there? It's kind of like if you're ever familiar with martial arts, it's like a judo, or I'm trying to remember if it's jiu-jitsu. The idea of when the enemy attacks, you use their own attack against them. Kind of what she's doing here. She gives ground, but when the punch comes, rather than letting it hit her, smack in the face and knock her down, that place where she says, and yet, is where she takes the approaching punch and leads it and flips it on its back and sort of turns the tables. Okay. So what I want you guys to do in the discussion here for the second part of our week this week, I want us to focus on your thoughts. So review this material, and I want you to start thinking about what are some questions or something about this, your thoughts in this matter. I'd like you to share those, and let's engage in a little conversation about it so that we can sort of see where people are and what your thought process is. And we'll use this as a preview to then go into next week when we'll dive into this a little bit further. We're going to treat this as kind of just like a trailer preview for what's to come as we begin to think beyond our argument, and we'll dive into more details next week.